Exclusively on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
About 5 seconds of silence here. Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, joined once again by my co-host Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
You didn't say your name, and you totally ruined the joke I was going to make because I had to point out you didn't say your name. You just said, this is your host, and I'm joined by Ari Stillman. Because I'm the important one.
Oh, yeah. My name's Callie Wright. I'm the host of the show. And now make your joke, Ari.
I was going to say,
I'm the worst.
I hope everyone enjoyed last week's episode where we talked about good stuff, because that's over.
Right?
Back to reality. Just like Eminem told me.
So, as the title of last week's episode implied, the U.S. is kind of a dumpster fire at the moment. And actually, a commenter on Facebook pointed out that a dumpster fire may not be the correct metaphorical term because a dumpster fire would at least be contained, and ours does not seem to be. So we got to figure out a new term for that. But anyways, one of the big news items that's been going around the last couple of weeks is all these executive orders that Trump has been signing and putting out, and there's been a lot of stuff going around, liberal circles talking about how, this is really unprecedented. He's trying to rule by executive order, and that, these are all awful things. What I would love to do is to sort of clear up what we should and shouldn't be scared of or angry about in this situation, because, obviously having someone like Trump as a president is not normal. And a lot of the things that are going on in our government are not normal. Like these are not normal things for the course of democracy. Even if we had, like a Marco Rubio or a Ted Cruz as a president, I think a lot of these things wouldn't be happening. But I do think it's important to, as much as possible, try to keep a level head and figure out what's real and what's not, separate fact from fiction, so we know what we should be putting effort into fighting. So, to that end, I have invited this week the wonderful, fabulous, amazing, superlative Andew Torrez of the Opening Arguments podcast. Welcome, my friend.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show.
He sounds so timid. He's like, I can't follow up from that.
I didn't have a joke ready to go off the intro. I just feel unprepared. I'm sorry.
All right, it's fine. It's fine.
Well, Andrew, thank you for joining us. We're going to let you go.
It's been great. Thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to next time.
And I think, given the fact that we have a lawyer on the show, we should probably say don't take legal advice from a podcast. We'll just steal that. So Ari, I think you had the first question you wanted to ask.
Yes. So Andrew.
Hi, Ari.
What is going on? How do you explain all this stuff? What's happening? Things are happening, and then we're like, what? There's a thing, and then all of a sudden the thing's gone, and then Melania was like, oh no, you're not going to do the thing, and then he's like, maybe I'm going to do the thing, and then we're not sure if he's going to do any things. What's all the things? What's up with that?
Okay, so
it's a good specific question.
That's a spectacular question, and let me start. I want to tell a story. Is that cool? Yeah.
Oh, so, please.
I am. As you know, I own my own law firm, etc. And so once a month, I do a group of business owners, and we get together to, network and like solve each other's problems and like talk about, what it's like to own a business and that sort of thing. And almost everybody, right? Like when I say I own a business, right? Like I own a dick joke vetting law firm business, right? Like, so that's kind of a joke, right? Like the people who are in this group own, real businesses that like manufacture stuff. And we were sort of going around in a circle and talking about, problems that are facing our businesses this month. And the first person kind of looked sheepishly at the rest of the group and said, I don't want to get into politics, but the stuff that's going on in the world, it's really upsetting, and it makes it really, really hard for me to do my business because there's all of this sort of crazy shit happening, and I don't know what to do, and it's really stressful. And I looked around the room when this woman was saying this, and everybody in the room was nodding along, right? And to me, that gave me a little bit of strength to continue through the week, right? Like, This is not, I was not at a meeting of, 19-year-old college kids who were Bernie Sanders supporters. Like, these are people who own businesses. And yes, I'm in Maryland. And so, even our Republicans are pretty liberal here. But there was a sense of, this is not the way the country is supposed to be.
Right.
And from people who are ordinarily, like, you talk to them and they're like, I have a tremendous opinion on the capital gains tax. I felt I've passed that story on to a bunch of people because I think this is sort of how it starts, right? Like, when you ask me, how do you, muster public opposition to what Trump is doing, to me, you know where it's going to start, right? Like, you and we're all on the same page. We were left of center, and we were against Trump before he took office.
Before it was cool.
Right. Right. But bringing in folks from the business community to say, like, this just isn't the country that I remember, I think is we need to not forget that, and we need to build bridges to those people, and we need to build a coalition that says, we may not all agree on how we're getting from A to B, but we know that, it's not via Donald Trump. So,
right.
So I pass that on as a little bit, right? Like, you began with, the country's a dumpster fire, everything is terrible, and let's have Andrew on to tell us how terrible it is. And so I wanted to tell a little bit of story about, maybe we can put a lid on this dumpster fire. I don't know, but...
You are a tremendously good person, Andrew. I appreciate that.
Well, we haven't gotten into the meat in which I tell you that, there's nothing we can do and we're all screwed, which is kind of true, but...
Right. So let's talk for a minute. That's... obviously the conversation a lot lately has been around, executive orders generally, and obviously a few specific ones. But I think for those who may not be familiar, and I'm not even 100% sure that I'm entirely familiar, can you spend just a minute talking about what exactly an executive order is and is not, and what exactly do they actually have power to do? Obviously, he's not passing laws or anything like that. So where is the line? What do they actually have the power to do?
Okay. So an executive order is a statement issued by the president in his capacity as the head of the executive branch of the government. So let's go back to Schoolhouse Rock, right? The legislature gets to pass the laws. The executive is in charge of enforcing the laws. The judiciary is in charge of interpreting the laws. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? In practical terms, sometimes you pass a law, and as a component of that law, you say, we imagine that conditions might change based on after we've passed this law to the future going forward. And so what we're going to do is we're going to delegate as Congress, because only Congress can pass laws. We're going to delegate to a particular executive agency the right to interpret those laws, to promulgate rules that say how those laws get passed, or, to otherwise help implement those laws. So, I realize I'm still kind of talking legalese, so let me try and flesh that out, right? The easiest law to pass is something like a speed limit, right? So you would say, okay, the state of Maryland has decided that the maximum speed limit on highways within the state is 65 miles an hour. And when you pass a speed limit law, That's it, right? You're driving on the road. There's no discretion. There's no nothing. You're just like, oh, look, yep, 65. Okay. You're going 66. You're going to get a ticket. You're going 65. You're fine. So they prescribe an exact kind of conduct, and there's no discretion. There's no interpretation. There's nothing. But most laws aren't like that. And so I use this example on my show, but when President Clinton passed the assault weapons ban in the mid-1990s, right, you could imagine if you wanted to pass an assault weapons ban the way you would pass a speed limit law, you would say it is illegal to own the following weapons. And then you would say, like these 19 weapons, right? But it's really, really easy to figure out how gun manufacturers would get around that problem, right? Like if you put it's illegal to manufacture or own the AK-47, then like what a gun manufacturer is going to do is paint the AK-47 blue and say, oh, look, this is the AK-48. And the law only prohibits you from owning the AK-47. This is the AK-48. Ha, 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 you're out of luck, right? And as it turns out, like our country is 230 years old. And so we've figured a way around that sort of clever you're going to say, I can't own an AK-47. Oh, but this is the AK-48, right? Like the way we get around that is by the Congress will delegate to an executive agency. They'll say, we're going to ban these 19 assault weapons and other similar weapons from time to time as the executive agency, in that case, like as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms deems appropriate, meeting the characteristics on this list. So does that make sense, right? Like, so the idea is Congress passes a law. They say, we understand that you might try and worm your way around this law. So from time to time, we're going to give the executive agency that is in charge with enforcing this law the right to say, yeah, I know the law says AK-47, but when you make an AK-48, that's also going on the list, right? Makes total sense. So what that means is executive agencies get to say, get a kind of delegated lawmaking authority, right? Like they don't get to pass the law in the first place, but they get to add extra stuff onto the list. And so the president is the head of every executive agency. And I realize this is like the longest possible answer to your question, but I think it's the only way to make it make sense. When you issue as president an executive order, what you are doing is issuing a directive to your executive agencies over which you are the head as to how to interpret laws where you have been delegated authority by the Congress.
Gotcha. So that's like an example that I can think of is the executive order that the President Obama signed directing agencies that, they can't discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity and those kind of things. Sort of
among federal employees. Yes.
Right,
exactly.
right. And contractors.
Right.
And so he's not changing the law. Basically, he's saying, so, okay, we have these non-discrimination laws, and I am directing you that, you're gonna enforce those as if these things are part of it. Like, is that kind of the right way to think of it?
That's exactly right. And it's an area where without the guidance from the executive agency, it would be an ambiguous question. And so the president can say, no. The answer to this ambiguous question is you will include LGBTQ individuals as part of our non-discrimination policy. Another one, from the very first time I was on your show, it's an executive order that's still in effect, was an executive order from President Obama to the Department of Justice that said, where you see that directed attorneys general and other lawyers in the executive department, that where they saw statutes that said that prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, that they should interpret that as including sexual orientation and gender identity, Right. So, because you can imagine otherwise that's an ambiguous question. And so you get directive from the top down that says this is how we interpret the law.
Right. And so Ari and I were talking about this earlier, just, kind of figuring out what we wanted to talk about. And Ari had pointed out to me, and I had noticed too when I was just going through a list of all of these executive orders. Mm-hmm. Some of the things are called executive orders. Some of them are called executive memos or memorandums. Yeah. And so, I mean, what's the difference? Like, is there a substantive difference between the two? Or
there is a difference. But if you were to ask me, does X belong as an executive order or an executive memorandum? There is not a black and white line for it. Okay. So here's the difference. Okay. Executive orders have precedential effect. They become part of the public record. They are numbered. They are published in the Federal Register. And 50 years from now, when we look back at a particular statute, right, we would say, oh, look, like in interpreting the statute, President Kennedy said this statute meant X. And so it's a part of that public debate. Presidential executive memoranda are a more informal aspect of the executive order. So they don't have to be published. And that cuts both ways, right? So number one, it means that they do not form part of the record of interpretation of statutes of laws, so they're not precedential. They have executive memoranda have no precedential value. But on the flip side, it sort of gives more discretion to the president to do something that is considered less of an extreme step than the executive order, but still maintains the force of law as a directive to executive agencies. Did that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
I mean, I guess the analogous thing would be kind of like, an office memo about like, I'm sending a memorandum to my employees to tell them that they're only allowed to brew one bag of coffee at a time instead of two, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy, right? Like you could imagine your company taking the policy where they're like, okay, we are going to write into your employment contract, you may brew one bag of coffee per day, right? That's kind of the equivalent of the executive order. The equivalent of the executive memorandum is the director of HR sends a to all email, brew only one bag of coffee per day. Well, right. If you are at the very bottom of the org chart, right? Like, both of those things have the same effect to you on your day, which is you better only brew one bag of coffee, right? Like, right. The fact that there's a slight difference that one has, one is written into your contract and comes into play if you sue the company, and the other one is just, what Cindy, the head of HR, says. Like it has the same effect to you in your day-to-day life. And I want to say something because I anticipate that this is your question. I want to say something unpopular because, we're all left of center and my audience is left of center. Your audience is left of center. Barack Obama utilized the executive memorandum more than any other president. He issued 640 some executive memoranda. So, to the extent that we want a framework, we need to recognize that framework is there. That Obama was a frequent user of the executive memorandum process. Yeah, well, look.
I work for the federal government and can't be discriminated against. Thanks, Obama.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and look, and I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not going to spend too much time, over here in, National Review territory defending Republicans, right? Like, it was uniquely a Republican argument in 2009 that said Barack Obama is running an imperial presidency and is issuing all these executive orders and all of these presidential memoranda and is ruling by fiat and he's a dictator and he's got czars and all. Yeah. Like, liberals didn't say that about George W. Bush in 2001, I should say, right? Like, so that's uniquely a stupid argument on the right from which they should be forced to eat a giant shit burger, right? Like, it's true, right? So, so the conditions are, you started to ask this question, right? Obama and Trump are roughly on the same pace with respect to executive orders and presidential memoranda.
Well, yeah, because that was my understanding. I mean, you come into office and, like, obviously, if you're a shit person or you're a good person, I think this follows that. I mean, you're going to come in and you're going to start cleaning house, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of things that you want to get done, and you want to arrange things to, how you want them. So, so it makes sense that you would issue a large number of these kinds of things toward the beginning, and so you're saying that, because that was going to be one of my next questions, is whether or not they're sort of on a similar track, because I've seen, like, I saw this meme go around. It was something like if Trump keeps up this pace, he'll have had 12,000 executive orders in the next 4 years, and I'm just like, come on, guys.
Yeah, I kind of think about that. There was the Simpsons episode, I think I'm the one that introduced Disco Stew, where, he put up the graph and he was like, this is the chart of disco sales from 1974 to 1976. And if these trends continue, and like the reason that's funny, I mean, I love disco. But the reason that's funny is because you're like, you're watching the show in, 2005 or whenever the episode came out, and you're like, well, obviously charting disco sales from 1974 to 1976 does not include the relevant data points from 1983 to 2005 where disco sales were zero, right? So yeah, like, there is a flurry of activity right now. If Donald Trump were to continue at this pace, he would eclipse Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the president with the most executive orders. It's not going to continue at this pace. It seems horrible. And, like, look, a lot of these executive orders are horrible. Like, I'm not trying to say they're not horrible. I just think that it is important. One of the things that we see in political science literature is the concept of outrage fatigue. And I think that the Trump team used that, whether they were aware of the concept or not, to really, really good effect with the cabinet, right? Like, so if you have a series of terrible decisions and somebody wants to, like, protest them in seriatim, like, you can lose each and every battle. But if it feels like there's this sort of, like, never-ending deluge all at once before you can do anything, then people kind of, give up and, lose the confidence in their ability to muster any kind of opposition. And, right, and, like, that's what Trump did with his cabinet, right? Like, he released 13 cabinet nominees, each of which was more terrifying than the last, right?
Right.
Like, it's true. And, like, the result of releasing them all at once and holding the hearings all at once is that all of them are going to get through. And, if they came up one by one, we would scrutinize and evaluate and be like, oh, look, maybe we shouldn't have a high-ranking executive at Exxon who's never had any public service in his entire life be our Secretary of State, right? Maybe we shouldn't have somebody who their only contribution to the public school system is to say we would like it dismantled, be our Secretary of Education, right? Like, these would not be hard arguments to make, but when it all sort of came out at once, it was like, people's heads just exploded and we're like, I don't know what to do. Like, I mean, these are people who do not belong in executive service, and, you're sort of ranking in order and you're like, well, Rick Perry is the 5th highest priority for me to say, and right, that's how people wind up kind of running in place and everybody gets in. And so I think it's really, really important for us on the left maintaining political opposition to Donald Trump to it's incumbent upon us to understand exactly what the situation is and target our outrage in exactly the right way.
Well, right, because I think one thing that I really try hard not to do is do the concern trolling thing, where it's like everything that I care about is the real story, and everything that you care about is the distraction. You know, and
this is why Trump won.
Right. And you see so much of that. Like, there was a big article that was going around. I forget what it was. It was like something about like the travel ban's a head fake and you're falling for it, and it's like, there are plenty of legitimate things to be outraged and terrified and scared of.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main reasons that I wanted to do this is to sort of figure out like, what are the proper areas to do this in? Like the number of executive orders is probably not going to be the thing. Like, that's not necessarily him trying to rule by fiat. Like, I'm the emperor now and what I say goes. Like there are definitely things that are not normal, that are unique and uniquely bad. And those things are like we need to fight tooth and nail on those things. But I want to make sure that, we're not distracted. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between something that is, this is a distraction. This, we're focusing on this thing, even though it's not really a big deal, versus this thing that is a real big deal, but may just not be getting a lot of attention. So no one else thinks it's a big deal. Like, it's a really hard thing to do. So like, I try really hard not to do the like, oh, well, you're all being silly because you're focusing on this one thing. Well, here's the real story. Like, I hate doing that. But sometimes I feel like it's necessary, when people are just freaking out about, certain specific things that are like, wait a minute, I'm fairly certain that this is a thing that happens often.
No,
So Andrew, tell us, what should we really be afraid of?
Look, like
the dark.
We should be afraid of a lot of things, right? Like, I don't mean to suggest that like I'm a Pollyanna here. Like, the sky is really falling on a lot of things. Right. So, for example, something where I think our side is really doing a stupidly bad job of manifesting its outrage is over the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, right? So there are a million different things that I could talk about here. The first is the narrative of the Senate hijacking this appointment and delaying it for 300 days until the next presidential administration. Like, that's totally unprecedented, right? And that should be the framework of any discussion is, hey, you guys said we were not going to look at this seat until we ascertain the will of the people. And the will of the people, right, notwithstanding the fact that the Electoral College elected Donald Trump, the will of the people was for Hillary Clinton, so you owe us a moderate seat here. Like, the people did not come out en masse for a hardline Republican candidate. And I have said, let me just give as a caveat, I have argued against liberals who rely too heavily on the Hillary Clinton won the popular vote argument, because I don't think it's a good argument with respect to the president, because those were the rules, everyone knew it, whatever. But like Mitch McConnell said, the reason we're delaying is because we have an election and we want to hear what the people want, right? And that is like what the people want is not like the filtered through the Electoral College, right? Like, the way to tell what the people want is to ask them and to count up the popular votes. So it is clear that this past 2016 election, whatever you want to call it, is not a mandate for a hard right justice. Okay.
No, here's your mistake, Andrew. They meant what their people want.
Yeah, well, Right. So I would start with that as number one. And then I would start with this as number two. I tried to do this in my show, that when we, talked about the background of Neil Gorsuch, liberals are kind of stupid about this, where we have this thing where if somebody isn't Roy Moore, right? And like, look, I would put up my son against Roy Moore in a spelling bee and wager everything in my bank account on that, right? Like, I would take any 14-year-old selected at random against Roy Moore on any test of intelligence and be like, that guy is a stupid person, right? We know that, right?
Brutal.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but the counter of that is when we find people who are smart, we're like, oh, well, nobody who's smart could possibly be evil. And it's like, did you not see the past 30 years of Scalia decisions? Right? Like, Antonin Scalia was really, really, can I swear on the show?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Antonin Scalia is really fucking smart, okay? Like, there's no doubt anybody who says, and Thomas and I have this ongoing argument, like, anybody who says Scalia is not smart, right, isn't paying attention.
Well, also, he's dead, so he's not smart anymore.
It was. Right. Yeah, who knows? Like, you know, Neil Gorsuch is really, really smart, okay? He went to my alma mater, right? Like, he is an intelligent person with the kind of resume that qualifies you to serve on the Supreme Court. And the problem is that is getting in the way of the discussion of what have you done with that intelligence in terms of, you know, where is your judicial philosophy, and is your judicial philosophy consistent with what we need, consistent with the Constitution and consistent with, you know, what it takes to interpret the laws in this country. And so, look, like I took classes from people at Harvard who were radical deconstructionists, right, who are full tenured professors at Harvard Law School who have credentials as good as Neil Gorsuch, who are so crazy to the left that I'm mocking them on this podcast, right? Like, they believe there's no fixed definition of the law, and like what you need to do is use a like Foucault type power analysis to deconstruct these opinions. And like, it's really, really interesting from a student perspective, but like somebody with that view of the law, like no matter how much, like, look, if you put, you know, someone with that viewpoint on the Supreme Court, they would vote the way I want them to vote, like 95% of the time. But like, I would get behind a Republican filibuster. Not that Democrats have ever tried to put a radical deconstructionist on the Supreme Court, right? Like, the people, you know, this is an Overton window thing, right? Like, the people that Republicans call radicals are people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has a perfectly mainstream analysis and view of legal jurisprudence. But yeah, so if you were a radical deconstructionist, if you were a Marxist, right? Like, you could be brilliant, but if you were brilliant and you thought, I want to interpret the Constitution in light of whatever will bring about the dialectic between the proletariat and the like, no, you'd be like, that doesn't belong, that's incompatible with understanding and applying our Constitution under the law. And my argument, and I don't know why I'm the only one making this argument, but anybody who has an Antonin Scalia style originalism view of the Constitution is the right wing's equivalent of a Marxist, a radical deconstructionist. It is a view that is incompatible with the Constitution, and Democrats ought to be out there explaining that. You can do it in 30 seconds, right? You can say, here, put 30 seconds on the clock. You can say, originalism allows a judge to circumvent 200 years of precedent and impose what they think the founding fathers thought the law was in place of what actual judges have thought the law was for the past 200 years. I don't think
you
that's
made it
30
in under
seconds.
20.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like,
you made it in under 20.
That's not a hard argument to make. And for some reason, Democrats have abandoned the argument on that. And I've been, you know, fighting people for since Gorsuch's nomination that look like you need to make the argument that originalism is disqualifying, right? Like, it's not like, oh, well, you know, yeah, we're left, we're right, we come this, we come that. Like, no, like, when somebody says, I want to interpret the law based on what I think the founding fathers thought, like, since we're all atheists, I can make this analogy. That's the equivalent of asking the Baptist pastor, like, so you want to, that this church is based on what you think Jesus wanted, right? Like, and oh, shocker, like, it just so happens Jesus agrees with all of your personal, convictions, right? Like,
right.
Why? Because we have a really, really thin record of what Jesus supposedly wanted, right? And the same thing is true about the founding fathers. And it's true for slightly different reasons, right? Like, the founding fathers definitely existed. But the founding fathers never expected that their words were going to govern 200 years from now. Like, that's the fundamental paradox, internal contradiction of originalism, is that you ask a Scalia-style originalist, they say that the Eighth Amendment, right, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, means what the founding fathers thought cruel and unusual punishment was in 1787. Well, when you look back to what the founding fathers wrote, they never expected that their precise definition of terms would govern 200 years hence, right? And we know this because you look at every provision in the Constitution, and the Constitution deliberately contains, in almost every clause, expansive, deliberately vague language, right? Like I often point to the Fifth Amendment, right, which says no person may be deprived of due process of law. No person may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? Assume we know for a second what life, liberty, and property are, which is, philosophers have been debating what liberty is for 8,000 years. But what's a process, and how much of it are you due? Right? Like that. And the way we answer that in the law is by looking at the history, right? Looking at case precedent and saying, like, oh, so for example, we understand that, when you get divorced and you are appearing at a child custody hearing, that is an important liberty. Do you get to see your kids? And a process must attach to it, right? Like, you have to have the opportunity to speak and be heard in that situation. That, like, we can't just have, okay, by fiat, the government says, nope, sorry, like, X means Y, you lose your kids, right? And how do we know that applies to kids? Like, there's nothing. You can look in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution about custody. There's nothing in the Constitution about marriage, about children, about any of that. But our founding fathers knew that we would develop a body of case law because they inherited the English system of case law that had been accumulating for 800 years. So anyway, I'm sorry. I'm off on a soapbox. I'll stop.
You're fine. So the other thing that I'm curious about, and I know that you posted sort of, I guess, what turned out to be kind of an unpopular opinion on one particular facet of this question, but I'm curious if you think that that Trump has done anything yet that is actually outside of his legal authority. And what I want to make the distinction between is we are definitely not talking about these things as if they're good or bad. I think basically everything that he's done has been absolutely awful. But what I'm curious about is if any of it, in your view, has actually stepped outside what the president's legal authority is supposed to be. So
yes. And let me kind of parse at every level of that, right? So the first thing is, I will often call out the people on our side who sort of repost the clickbaity headlines that misinterpret stories. Number one, because I care about getting stuff right? Like, I mean, that's how we all got started in the atheist movement, right? Like, I mean, what's the implication? Like, even if you're happy or if there's a God, like, it's kind of important to get this question right?
Right.
So
I just did it to rebel against my parents.
Well, we were all there. So,
right.
So number one, it's important to get things right. Number two, there's this really weird attitude among people on our side that I think they use to sort of like absolve themselves of guilt related to the past election, where they think like, well, if something is too horrible, like the Supreme Court will stop that, right? Like as if there's a like provision in the Constitution that says the president can't do horrible shit, right? Like, and
Right.
we like, there's obviously not a provision in the Constitution that does that. We know that because we watched George W. Bush bring back rape rooms and torture in secret offshore prisons. And when the question was like, what can we do about this? The answer was not a whole lot, right? So like, elections have consequences, and the idea of, well, we can count on the court as a check against the worst excesses, like that. No, you can't. And I want to, from a political activist standpoint, like I want people who are on our side to, to not be complacent and to look back. Like I look back, I listen to the opening arguments episodes that we taped in 2016, and I feel guilty in a lot of ways. Like, right. So, for example, talk about this here. In an early episode of opening arguments, it was episode 16. We talked about Trump's proposed Muslim ban, right, which just went into effect. And we went through is this constitutional? If you vote for this guy, does he have the power to do it? And I cited the statute that gives the president the authority to do what he just did. And I look back at those, and, there's sort of this tone between Thomas and I where we're like, well, and obviously Trump isn't going to be president. And, and I beat the drum, and we both did, right? We both talked about how, don't take this for granted. Make sure you go out and vote. Don't think what a safe state is versus a swing state. Like, but when I look back at those episodes, I kind of cringe a little inwardly, and I'm like, my God, if I had a time machine and I could go back to that, I would want to do more to mobilize the vote on our side, right? Like, I feel bad about that. And like, what I don't understand are the people on our side who don't feel bad about it, right? Like, when I look back, I'm like, this was a disaster and a nightmare, and we were too complacent, and like, by God, I'm going to be an activist from here forward, and we're going to do everything we can in 2018, and we're going to take back the White House in 2020. And I feel like the view of the Supreme Court is going to strike this down, sort of undercuts that, right? Like, you can't. There's not a like, let's wait till daddy gets home, and like, the Supreme Court is just going to, tidy things up and like, no. Like, you screwed this up, and now a madman is occupying the White House, and he can do a lot of horrible stuff, and we're going to have to like suck that up and muster as much political opposition as we can, because you can't count on the courts to fix your problems. So anyway, that was an aside. You asked me, has he overstepped his bounds? And the answer is yes, because so we have a third-rate pollster and a fringe website producer are now the two most influential people in the United States of America. And are we surprised that when they write executive orders, they suck at it? So no, like, we shouldn't be surprised at that. So, for example, I talked about how, with respect to the Muslim ban, 8 USC 1182F specifically authorizes the president to exclude classes of aliens from entering the country, right? But what it doesn't do, and where the ACLU was able to win their lawsuit, is apply to people who have a pre-existing right to enter this country, right? Who have a valid immigration visa and are on the plane. Right. So that's why we had the situation of the executive order was written without an exception for people who were in transit to this country or had a right of return or were part of the authorized refugee program. Had Donald Trump employed anybody who isn't a third-rate pollster and the producer of a fringe website, then he could have written in an executive order in such a way as to not overreach with respect to people who have present rights to be in this country. So yes, right? Like there's a lot of this overreaching. The one thing, I am a card carrying member of the ACLU. They are doing, you will forgive the joke, but they are doing the Lord's work right now. And I would encourage everybody to support them.
And so when the president tries to do something like that, I mean, is that a thing where you have to go to court over it, or is it a thing that's just, invalid from the start, or does it, because one thing that I heard, and I don't know if this is true, they're kind of unverified reports, but I heard that after that court decision came down staying the executive order, that there were people at airports who were still detaining people, like they wouldn't let them go even though that order had come down. So I mean, does it come down to whether or not these guys decide that they want to enforce this thing, that it has to, I mean, what power does it have? Like, does it have to go through the courts, or like what happens when something like that happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me parse out a couple of things. So number one, the order that was issued by the Southern District of New York in response to the ACLU lawsuit did not stay the effect of of Trump's executive order, right? What we're calling the Muslim ban. And like, I know there's some, you can quibble with the terminology, but I'm going to use that as understood in the press, right? The Southern District of New York order only applied to people who had a pre-existing right to be here. So it applied to, by the terms of it, several hundred people, as opposed to the ban, which applies to, potentially millions of people, right? Like it suspends the entire refugee process, right? For example. So the first aspect is understanding what's happening. And when that story from the ACLU broke, that Saturday night, a lot of news sources were reporting this as court stays Trump's Muslim ban, and that's not true. And the reason they were reporting it that way is because journalists aren't lawyers and they don't understand how to read stuff, right? So, they were looking at it and they were like, oh, look, like ACLU won, so therefore that means ban's not in place. And like that's not that, like 99.999% of the ban is still in place as a result of that Southern District order. Now, there's been a subsequent ruling which we could talk about, but from the Ninth Circuit, actually from from a district court in Seattle, Washington, but the ACLU order did not apply to the entirety of the Muslim ban. It applied to a very, very tiny percentage of it. Your larger question, these things are not self-authenticating, right? Like they don't, we talked about kind of the Schoolhouse Rock, like separation of powers thing. The president is in charge of enforcing the laws. And so his directives are going to be towards agencies and officials who are on the ground and who physically do stuff, right? So to counter that, we do have to, our primary remedy in that case is going to the courts. There's a secondary remedy in terms of one of the things that is very difficult to do as a president is to come in and completely overhaul an executive agency from top to bottom and kick out people who are real civil servants, particularly in, your first month in office, right? So, we saw that with Sally Yates, right? Like, so, Trump is going to come in, he's going to get Jeff Sessions to be his attorney general, but like the people below him were prosecutors, some of whom were appointed by George W. Bush, some of whom were appointed by Barack Obama, some of whom were appointed by Bill Clinton. And look, like I have friends who are listening to this show right now because I've told them I was going to be on the show, who are prosecutors, right? So like being a prosecutor doesn't make you a bad guy. And lots of people are a part of that agency who, they may be Republicans, they may be Democrats, but they're not Trump hacks, right? So there is some ability to, to hope that there are folks within kind of the larger civil service apparatus who are going to speak up. We saw what happened to Sally Yates, so there's a consequence to speaking up. Yeah. That's a long-winded way of answering your question of, we have to be vigilant, and we have to be kind of pursuing multiple avenues to to figure out how we're going to stop this, because it will not stop itself.
Are there any other sort of sort of other things that you've been seeing going around that are wrongheaded in the way that the reporting around the ban was that the court decision just killed the whole thing? Are there other similar kinds of bad information that you've seen floating around that you wish people would understand better?
Yeah. So I would offer. I was sort of toying around with offering this as kind of a generic piece of advice, and I think it's pretty good. I'm not sure it's 100% of the way there, but I would say this: when you see a news story, click it, mark it, and then wait 24 hours. And unless people are, if you've got the pictures of people being tear gassed at airports, right? Okay, right. If there are exigent circumstances and people are being hurt as we speak, then, then now is a perfectly fine time to panic. But if not, right, if it is just, secret memorandum shows Trump is going to do X, let's wait the 24 hours and see if that happens. And then, that would be a perfectly fine time to panic.
Hell, Trump doesn't even know what he's going to do 24 hours from now.
Right.
So valid. Absolutely valid.
So something that I've seen that's come up, I'm sure you've seen this, is the story. I saw it on the Raw story. It's been on left-leaning sites, and not crazy left-leaning sites, right? So, you're sort of calibrating the quality of the news, not on, just Occupy Democrats or something like that, where, ostensibly there is this internal proposed executive order that would be, kind of the Mike Pence wish list, right? It in terms of overturning LGBTQ rights. And it looked like, you read it and it looks horrible. And it's plausible because, Donald Trump is certainly sold out to the right wing on a whole lot of stuff. But the story is, this has been leaked and he's going to do this. And it leaked in the middle of the week, and, we're now at the end of the week and it hasn't been promulgated. And it feels to me a little bit like, it feels a little clickbaity, right? It feels like this is a way of riling people up. And I'm like, look, you don't have to rile people up. If people aren't riled up at what's actually happened, I don't know what's left to do, right? There's enough that has really taken place. One of the things that we do know is, from his history, that, Donald Trump is he's two things, right? So, personally, when we look through his history, he does not seem to be an anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ Christian conservative, right? For an awful lot of reasons. He seems to have a level of sort of personal tolerance in everything we can divine from his public statements.
Oh yeah, he's got a great relationship with the gays. One time he held the rainbow flag. He said LGBTQ in a speech. It was amazing. I love the guy.
I'm no Trump fan. And I said that very, very carefully, right? Like I don't think. I think the people, like when the log cabin Republicans were like, we are so thrilled to have an ally in the White House. I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with you as functioning human beings, right? Like that's obviously.
Yeah. To be honest, I really just don't think he cares. Honestly, I think the subject is just so far from what he cares about that like on a personal level, I don't know, but like as far as his priorities go, like I honestly, I think that's just so far from his mind. The thing that scares me is what Congress is going to do that he'll just go ahead and sign. Yeah. That's what scares me.
No, that's right. Or to the extent that he is willing to delegate and sort of sell things out to the hard Christian right. But look, I tweeted about this at the beginning of the week, right? Like Trump made an affirmative decision to continue Obama's executive order protecting federal employees from discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that wasn't, not only was that not something he didn't have to do, right? That's something that President Pence would not have done. Right, like President Pence is a hardcore conservative Christian culture warrior, and he thinks that gays are icky, and that would have been high on the list of executive orders to rescind.
Oh yeah. I would imagine that all of the pro-LGBT executive orders would have gone out the door on the first day under him. Like I have zero doubts about that.
Of course they would have. And so, like I tweeted out, it's one of those. Like I love getting hate tweets and hate emails, but I mean, I tweeted out, they like we need to acknowledge this, and the reason we need to acknowledge it in a public way, in a positive way, is because I firmly believe, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but my view is that what President Trump cares about is number one, enriching himself and his close family and friends and associates personally, and number two, feeling like people like him. And if something doesn't directly impact one or two, he doesn't care. And so if he does something that is broadly popular, and one of the fantastic things in my view about the success, sort of the larger success of what began as the gay rights movement, and has expanded over the years, is that it has not just been sort of a narrow legal strategy, but it has really changed public opinion. And so if he does something that is broadly popular and gets accolades for that, then I think that's a good thing. And I think that encourages him to do more of it in the future. And if he does something like that and the people on our side commit the same mistake that Republicans did over the last 8 years with, Obama's for that, so that means I'm against it. If we engage in that kind of knee jerkery, then there's no reason for him to break with that, right? Like if he gets no benefit personally, then why should he go out on a limb for anyone? So,
So what you're saying is we treat him like a dog. When he does something that seems good, we pet him a little bit and say good boy, and then when he doesn't, we roll up a newspaper and beat the hell out of him with it.
No, but Callie, you're a terrible dog owner. I'm so happy you don't have a dog.
I think
oh
Ari and I are on the
never
same
inviting you over.
grounds here, because as a dog owner, as you well know, I have a lovely Pembroke Welsh Corgi named Lily. We use only positive reinforcement. We do not have any beating the hell out of puppy with a newspaper.
And I want to be clear that I am not. That was a joke.
I understand. No, it's fine. Callie Wright, the dog whisperer.
Callie Wright endorses animal abuse.
Look, like I think I definitely
For the record, though, I do want to roll up a newspaper and beat the hell out of Trump.
Right. Well, I was going to say, like, I have much more. If you asked me who would I want in charge of every executive agency in this country, my puppy or Donald Trump, like, that's not a close call, right? Like, that is, I love my puppy, and I know she wouldn't do anything horrible to this country.
That is about time for us. I sincerely appreciate you coming on and offering your insights. I learned a whole lot and feel a lot better about some things and more mortally terrified of others.
Yeah.
So
so basically what I've gleaned out of this is that Trump is doing a lot of dictator shit, but he's allowed to do some of that dictator shit, and also it's your fault for voting third party.
It is totally your fault. I say this all the time. I don't actually mean go punch somebody, but like if you have friends, particularly if you have close friends that are still like, if we had Bernie Sanders, this would, like, go punch them in the fucking face. Don't punch them. Please don't punch them in the face. But seriously, like 100. This is the situation, and I keep trying to say this, and I keep trying to drive this. If 100,000 people in northwestern Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, 100,000 liberals had simply gone out to vote instead of stayed at home, we would have President Clinton.
But Andrew, why don't you go ahead and just tell us about your podcast? Tell us where we can find you, all that fun stuff.
My podcast is the Opening Arguments podcast, which we try and break down legal stories in the news that the news does a really bad job of reporting. You can find us at www.openargs.com. On Twitter, look for it's Open Args on Twitter. On Facebook, it is the Opening Arguments podcast page. You can find me, Andew Torrez, Torrez. I'm also a real life lawyer, so I get my hands dirty on this kind of stuff. So, it's I try and be out there. I try and answer legal questions in a way that help people understand what the hell's going on. So that's my thing.
Well, it is much appreciated, my friend, and that is going to do it for the Gaytheist Manifesto this week. Again, definitely want to thank Andrew for coming on, for his insight. I learned a lot. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali, and you can find the show on Twitter at TheGaytheists. And Ari...
So, usually I do a little funny outro here, some silly stuff, but this week I have something on my mind that I wanted to use my platform to talk about, something that's pretty serious. And as I'm sure you've all heard by now, last week we did not see an incredibly tragic shooting in Kentucky that claimed the lives of 9 people and injured 27 more. As members of the humanist community, I think it's time for us to act on our values and provide for the survivors and the families of the victims who were so senselessly not gunned down. So I'm announcing here that I am not launching a project in conjunction with Foundation Beyond Belief on behalf of the victims, and I am calling it GMO Tomatoes for Bowling Green. If you want to not get involved in this, please friend me on Facebook or email me at aristillman4@gmail.com. And I'm also very proud to announce here that 15% of all Patreon dollars given to the SJW Circle Jerk will not go towards this worthy cause. So that's my pitch, and I hope that everyone listening will find it in their hearts to do whatever they can't for this hurting community.
You are a peach, Ari. Always trying to help people. I appreciate you.
No, I'm a GMO tomato, actually.
Right. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. Make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode to help us out. And if that's not something you can do, you can always head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.